I get the pleasure of introducing Tina Ludwig, who is actually the first time she's been here, but she started this course series along with two of her colleagues at ETH and invited me to join, and it was a great gift, I think, now that we're in our 5th year of doing this. Because I'd been saying to Mike, we gotta do this, and then we had collaborators at the Broad who'd said, yeah, we're gonna do a targeted proteomics course, and I was just like, it'd been years we've been working on the software, and felt like, when are we actually gonna do this? And Mike would say, yeah, we should definitely do that, but Tina really provided the model, that course at ETH Zurich provided the model, and I got to attend it and help teach it for two times before I actually was brave enough to come back here. And I was even emailing Mike going like, oh, we got to make time in the schedule for coffee breaks and do this get-to-know game, and because those things all seem to work so well in Switzerland. And Tina has also been an incredible collaborator to work with, offered lots of feature suggestions and complaints about features that didn't work well. And so as you learn to use Skyline, you can definitely thank her, and she's also a really great presenter. We have many proof of a lot of participant feedback over the years, and so you get the pleasure of presenting right now.
Wow, thanks a lot, Brandon, for this introduction. Now I'm really scared of disappointing all of you here. And also big thanks back to you and to Mike for inviting me here to Seattle. For me, this is the first time ever in Seattle, and it's really a pleasure to be here and to teach with this very motivated group of people and instructors here throughout this coming week. Okay, so the aim of my basic lecture here at Monday morning is to introduce you to the most important basic concepts and principles of targeted mass spectrometry. And giving this first intro lecture of the course on Monday morning is always a bit of an unthankful task, because I think you're a very heterogeneous crowd of people here and with very different experience levels. So for those of you who are already very experienced in doing targeted proteomics and in particular doing SRM, what I will tell you now in this next hour was probably just a wrap-up of things that you already know. So I apologize already to those people. But on the other hand, we will also have people here in the course who are new to targeted proteomics, and therefore I think it's important to have these intro lectures at the beginning to bring everybody to the same page. So yeah, also I would just like to encourage you right from the beginning, in case you have any questions occurring during the lecture, please don't hesitate and just interrupt me at any time. I have structured my presentation into 4 parts, and each part is headlined by one fundamental question regarding targeted proteomics. We will start in part 1 by looking at what targeted proteomics actually is, and Mike already made quite a few points to that already, and just once more briefly discuss why this is actually something very useful to do. In the second part, we will look at how targeted data is acquired a bit more in detail, and we will focus on just one technology here, which will be SRM, but you will hear about the others also a lot throughout the week. And then in the third part, we will discuss a bit how to design a targeted proteomic experiment. And in the last part, I would like to look with you at some real data. I'm not sure we will manage in time for this last part, but if we don't manage now, it's also no problem to do it at a later stage when we do the tutorials. So let's see how it goes. I hope you have lots of questions, and then we will be late, usually. Okay, so let's get started with what is targeted proteomics. So when I prepared this presentation, I tried to find in the literature the definition of targeted proteomics. And what I realized that this is actually quite difficult, because when you look at different groups and how different groups define targeted proteomics, you will see that they use this term in quite different contexts or in slightly different meanings. So what I decided doing is I make my own definition of targeted proteomics. So Tina's definition is that targeted proteomics is an umbrella term for mass spectrometric methods that aim at accurately quantifying a list of predefined proteins, peptides, or peptides that carry post-translational modifications. So in other words, with targeted proteomics, you will typically not discover anything new. You will not find a protein that, or a PTM that has never been described before. Instead, what you do with targeted proteomics, you always try to specifically look for proteins or for PTMs for which you already have a hypothesis, or which you think they are important and interesting for your specific project, and then you try to validate or to falsify your specific hypothesis for these proteins by using a targeted proteomics approach. Okay? So, and as this you read here already, umbrella term, so actually into this field of targeted proteomics, or under this umbrella, there are several different mass spectrometric methods that fell into this category. There's not just a single mass spectrometric method, but in our days there are quite several different ones. And the two most classical and also historically probably the oldest methods that are termed targeted proteomic methods are SRM, selected reaction monitoring, and PRM, parallel reaction monitoring. And what's specific about these two approaches is that here you perform your measurement in a targeted fashion right from the beginning, because already the data that you acquire is targeted. So you tell the instrument specifically these peptides, these proteins, these masses I want to monitor. But in our days there are also alternative ways to do targeted proteomics. And these include, for example, DDA, so typical data-dependent acquisition or shotgun analysis, and also DIA, data-independent acquisition. And with these two mass spectrometric approaches, the special thing is that you can use these approaches in a targeted as well as in the untargeted way, depending on how you analyze the data. So the data acquisition itself with both of these methods is not performed in a targeted way, but after the acquisition, the data analysis can be performed in a targeted manner. And then these methods also fell into the category of targeted proteomics. Okay? So throughout the next 50 minutes of this lecture, we will focus mainly just on SRM. But you will hear about PRM and DIA and DDA a lot throughout the course, and you will have other instructors also introducing these techniques in more detail. What makes this slide a bit more complicated, or what's actually a kind of a problem in the field, is the fact that for all of these different methods that you see here, we also have different nomenclatures around that are used by the community. So for example, the term selected reaction monitoring, Mike brought it up already, you will also sometimes here refer to as multiple reaction monitoring. For PRM, you find in the literature names like targeted MSMS, MRM, high resolution, pseudo SRM or pseudo MRM. I think the targeted way of doing DDI is what you will hear referred to as MS1 filtering throughout this course. And also for DIA, in a targeted way, we have methods that are called SWOF-MS or hyperreaction monitoring, HRM. All of these alternative names refer to exactly the same technique. The reason why we have them around is mainly due to trademarking issues. So vendors just trademark specific names to their instruments, and this is why we will also in the future have to live with all these different names that are there for exactly the same thing. So I guess it's important that you're aware of it and that you just know what are the same methods and what the different methods and what are the commonalities and differences. And I'm sure by the end of this week you will know all of that very well here. Good. So no matter which of these targeted approaches now you decide working with, the advantage of all of them is always the same. What's this advantage? Now, targeted proteomics or discovery-driven proteomics or shotgun proteomics is definitely the ideal technique for you if you want to identify proteins and peptides or PTMs in your sample. So if you want to globally map out which proteins or peptides are present in a given sample. However, in the moment when you change your objective from identifying as much as possible towards quantifying as accurate as possible, then targeted proteomics becomes the method of choice for you, because with targeted proteomics you can just perform better quantification because you can measure your peptides and proteins more precise, more accurate, and more reproducible. And these features of precision, accuracy, and reproducibility become more and more important the more you move away from small experiments that just include a few samples to large-scale experiments where you have lots of samples. And especially this point of reproducibility becomes very, very important if you want to get meaningful data out of very, very large experiments. And this is why it's especially when you think large scale, many samples, targeted proteomics is just a very valuable technique and the ideal technique to address these issues. And the fact that these performance advantages are more and more recognized in the field, you could see also 2012, where targeted proteomics was selected as the method of the year by Nature Methods. Okay, that's all I wanted to say about what targeted proteomics is, what different approaches we have, what different methods, and why this is useful to do. Let's now have a look a bit more into the details of how it really works, in how the mass spectrometer really operates. And as I said, we will look in particular into SRM at this point here. So here you see once more the standard workflow. Mike also showed a similar slide already that we have in bottom-up proteomics, where we always start from some type of protein-containing sample, from which we extract the proteins, digest them, separate the peptides by various different techniques that are possibly available, usually at least by one HPLC step. Then we ionize the peptides, and up to this point of ionization, it really doesn't matter whether we're doing here a swath MS or an SRM or a DDA analysis. This is always the same. The difference really just starts at the stage of the mass spectrometer. And if you perform an SRM experiment, then the mass spectrometer that you will work with is a triple quadrupole mass spectrometer. And as this name already suggests, triple quadrupole mass spectrometers are consisting out of 3 quadrupoles. The first and the third quadrupole are both used as mass filters, while the second quadrupole serves as the collision cell. So if now a mixture of different peptides elutes at a certain time point from your HPLC column, and it enters the mass spectrometer, the first quadrupole will isolate, hopefully, ideally, just a single ion out of this mixture of ions. The single ion type will then be fragmented in the collision cell, and then you will again just select a single out of these multitude fragments that are formed, and then you will record the intensity of that single fragment ion over time, and this will lead to such a chromatographic trace or an SRM trace. So by no time point in SRM measurements you will record a full MS1 or a full MS2 scan. You always just record only pairs of precursor ions that are collected in the first quadrupole and the corresponding fragment ion that's isolated in the third quadrupole. And there is also a scientific expression for these Q1, Q3 pairs. They are called a transition, and I will use this term transition now very frequently through the rest of the presentation. So you know a transition is a pair of a precursor and its corresponding fragment. And it's these transitions that we are measuring in SRM. Now, what are the advantages of doing this type of measurement on triple quadrupoles? Now, quadrupole mass analyzers are very good in efficiently, or let's say an SRM setup, a triple quadrupole is very good in efficiently reducing noise. And that's because you do 2 filtering steps. You filter all your ions once in the first and once in the third quadrupole. And quadrupole mass analyzers are also very good in efficiently transmitting an ion through the quadrupole. So over 95% of the ions that enter the quadrupole, over 95% of that selected one will also make it through the quadrupole. And these 2 features here are reasons why you can measure so sensitively ions with this triple quadrupole in SRM mode, and why you're also so reproducible and accurate in your measurement points. And then a quadrupole is also good in quickly changing these settings, so you can quickly switch between different transitions and not just record an intensity for a single transition, but you can measure many transitions in one injection, and so you can do multiplexing. These are the advantages. There are also disadvantages, of course, and the major disadvantage of a quadrupole mass analyzer is the low resolution. So compared to an Orbitrap or to a TOF instrument, we have this very low resolution, which will always have a limited selectivity compared to the high mass accuracy, high resolution analyzers. We also have a limited number of proteins, peptides, or transitions that we can monitor per injection. We can measure several, but we are somehow bound to this range of tens to maybe 100 peptides per injection. And the major disadvantage of SRM is you need to know what to look for in advance. So you must tell the instrument in advance which masses to filter here in Q1 and Q3. Without that knowledge, you cannot start the measurement. Okay? So let's have a look at one specific example to make this very clear once more. So let's assume we want to monitor this peptide here by SRM. Okay? What you need to provide to the instrument in order to monitor that peptide is a table that you can simply paste into the method of that of your software that runs the mass spectrometer. And this table can look like this. There are 4 columns in that table that are absolutely required for every SRM measurement. That's the Q1 M/Z value, so that's the precursor M/Z value of that peptide that we want to monitor, and these are several different fragment ion M/Z value that we want to monitor. And you see I've selected here the Y5, the Y7, the Y8, and the Y10 fragment ion. And these are the 4 transitions I want to monitor for that peptide. That's the way how I tell the instrument you should do it. And then there are 2 additional columns that are also required. That's the collision energy column. So here you tell the instrument the energy that it should use on the second quadrupole to fragment your peptide. And then there is this last column of dwell time. Dwell time is also sometimes referred to as accumulation time or acquisition time. And that's the time that you would like to give the instrument to accumulate the signal for a given transition. And the longer you put this time, the better the instrument will be able to separate noise from a true signal. Okay? So ideally we want to have this very nice and long, because then we will get a very good signal to noise ratio. So once you've defined this table and pasted it into your instrument, into the acquisition software, what the instrument will do then, it will go to the first line of this table, and it will set the Q1 and the Q3 filtering according to these 2 numbers that you provided in the first line, and then it will it will filter the ions that are coming in for those 2 values, and acquire this intensity here over 250 milliseconds, as we specified this here, and then it will record an intensity value after these 250 milliseconds, which will be, for example, 2,600 counts per second. Once this is done, it will switch to the second line of that table. It will, in this case, it will keep Q1 and take another fragment ion in Q3. It does exactly the same, acquire for 250 milliseconds, record the intensity of that transition, and like this it goes through the whole table. And once the instrument reaches the end of this list, what it will do, it will simply jump back to the top and do it over and over and over again over the whole run, the whole gradient that you apply. Okay? So the data that comes out of this measurement, if you're lucky, if you have done everything correctly, might look like this. So here you see now the chromatic traces of all those 4 transitions over a certain retention time range. And you can see, yeah, they are all co-eluting. Mike said this already. If they are all originating from the same peptide, they should all have the same retention time and the same peak shape. They have different intensities. But actually, this figure that you see here is not really the raw data. This is already a figure that is processed by the analysis software, which extrapolated these peak shapes. The data that really the instrument measured were just distinct intensity values, right? This is what we just saw in the slides before. And then the software just comes and extrapolates a smooth line over all these intensity values. But with this knowledge about this intensity, this peak extrapolation, I think it becomes very clear that actually the time difference between 2 of these neighboring intensity data points is very important. This parameter is called the cycle time. And what we always want in order to have the software, to let the software do a good peak extrapolation, is we want to have enough data points over the elution profile of our peptide. So the rule of thumb that people work with is you should have at least 8 to 10 data points over this elution profile. So it really matters how close these 2 neighboring points are together. And in SRM, you can very easily calculate this cycle time. That's this parameter called the time between 2 neighboring points here. And this cycle time is simply the sum of all the dwell times of all transitions in your list. Because that's exactly the time the instrument needs to once go through the list and to jump back and do it over and over again. So in my little fake example here, I had 4 transitions, 250 milliseconds. That means if I sum them all up, it takes 1 second for the instruments to do this measurement. So the time difference between each data point is 1 second roughly. Okay? However, what I also think, or I hope becomes very clear, is that this cycle time is directly dependent on the dwell time and on the number of transitions that you have, right? And this figure here demonstrates this correlation between cycle time and dwell time very nicely. It's taken from a tutorial from 2008. And what you see here is in the black line should represent a true chromatographic peak. And now this peak was acquired with different dwell and cycle times. And the red and the pink curve were cycle times of 10 seconds or 20 seconds. And when you have a peak that here has roughly 30 seconds peak width, you can see that with 20 seconds you only get 2 data points over the elution profile. With 10 seconds you get maybe 3 data points over the elution profile. So you can, I think, appreciate that no software in the world will be able to nicely extrapolate the true peak shape from those little data points, right? However, when you go down with the cycle time to 2 seconds, this is now the blue and the green curve, they were actually getting very close to the true peak. And the difference between the two here is just the dwell time. So the blue curve has a very short dwell time of only 5 milliseconds. So you see the peak is much more spiky simply because we still have a lot of noise in the data. When we give the instrument more time to differentiate noise and true signal, we get this nice green line. Okay? So this is what happens to your signal, to your peaks, when you use not optimal dwell and cycle time. So with this very detailed intro into cycle time and dwell time and transitions, I hope this figure will be also now very easy for you, then because in SRM method design, you will always have to deal with the balancing act between 3 parameters, dwell time, cycle time, and number of transitions, peptides, proteins that you would like to target. And actually, a very similar slide you can also paint for PRM and also for SWOT or DIA measurements, because in all of these techniques we always have to balance between various different parameters. However, now here in SRM we have these 3 parameters, and what we always want to achieve in every SRM measurement, we want to be as sensitive as possible. And in order to be really sensitive, we need to differentiate noise from true signal, and for this we want to have long dwell times. And the rule of thumb, what people work with here are dwell times often in the range between 5 milliseconds if they are not very sensitive, or if you're rather targeting high abundant proteins or peptides, or 200 milliseconds when you want to be very sensitive. Next to sensitivity, we also want to be very accurate, so we want to extrapolate the true peak shape as good as possible, and I already said it, the rule of thumb here is to have at least 8 to 10 data points over your elution profile. And now is, of course, the next question is how wide is your elution profile, and this of course depends on your LC setup. So on many standard nano LC setups that people work with, we often have elution profiles in the range of, I would say, 15 to 30 or 40 seconds. So cycle times in a range of 1.5 to 4 seconds is what you will find in many publications. However, if you work with a fancy LC setup, it also might be, if you have very sharp peaks, very good chromatography, you would like to work with even a significantly shorter cycle time. And then we have the number of transitions and peptides. So usually people have always many peptides, many proteins they would like to monitor. And here the rule of thumb is work with 4 to 6 transitions per peptide, work with 3 to 5 peptides per protein, and the maximum number of transitions that you can put into a single list that you then tell the instrument is in the range of 1,000 transitions. So plus minus, and I would say that's a number that is quite straightforward, still doable with SRM. However, also this number is not achieved just like this. You need to do a small trick to measure 1,000 transitions in one go, and this trick is called retention time scheduling. Has anyone of you ever heard about that? Can somebody explain what retention time scheduling means?
Is it a scheduled MRM?
Scheduled MRM, yeah. How does it work?
Basically, you select a window,
Mm-hmm.
and that you have to know what retention time the peptide of interest will elute.
Mm-hmm.
And then based on the number of the transition you have in the list, you will decide what the window has to be. So the advantage is, the instrument is going to only trigger on that retention time plus or minus 10, 15 seconds for that particular. So this will allow you to, increase the number of the transition you're going after. But the downside is that if your retention time changes, you will lose a lot of information. So you might even not see anything. So there are advantages and disadvantages.
Super, exactly. That was the perfect explanation. There's not much for me to add. Exactly. Scheduled SRM means You do not monitor transition over your whole gradient. You just focus on an area where you expect your peptide to dilute. And the smaller you make this window around where your peptide dilutes, the bigger is the gain that you can make from it. You can put more transitions into your table, but another gain might also be you can improve your cycle time, or you can enlarge your dwell time. So there are many improvements you can think about to, again, have the optimal balanced method. So it's cool to make them nice and small. So 15 seconds plus minus around an expected peak is very small. So they are very brave when you do this. Because the big danger is if you're too small around the window and if your LT is not stable, it might be that you completely miss your peptide of interest. Exactly. Super. Yeah. So, but there is one problem with this retention time thing, or well, the way, or the prerequisite to do this is that you know where your peptide dilutes, right? Without the knowledge where the peptide 1 is here at 11 minutes and peptide 3 is at 38 minutes, without this knowledge, you cannot do this type of measurement. And so what you can do is, of course, you can do some preliminary experiments and measure the retention time of your peptide of interest on your instrument, and you find it's 12.5 minutes, okay? Now, you want to measure this peptide two weeks later, and by now the column has changed, or, you know, it's a new setup, and a lot of things can happen, and then this knowledge that you're looking for 12.5 minutes is not very useful for you. So retention time is actually something that is LC, platform, LC gradient, column length, column age, sample metrics dependent. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to store knowledge about your peptide retention time in, let's say, yeah, it's diluting at a certain minute. So what can you do? Yeah?
Create a tool.
Here we have
it here.
Internal
standard sample and check every time because you are running like 4-5 days. What is the real retention time? And you can change it.
Yeah, it's a very good point. But let's assume we are having 2,000 peptides or 1,000 peptides, or let's say we have 100 peptides that we always want to monitor. So you would always need to reshoot all that 100 peptides to find out.
Do 3 points: early RT, middle RT, and late RT, and just check that those 3 points are.
Yeah, that's also that's a very good point. Yeah.
Do retention time indices.
Exactly. Another way is, you are absolutely right. In a way, you describe exactly the same thing. You just said that you would use your target peptides to check on a few of them. And another way to do it is not even to use a target peptide, but to use some reference peptides, which you always spike into all of your samples, which is not then project dependent or so. And this is what I call here in this presentation the IoT concept, and I will come back later on that and explain this a little bit more in detail. Okay, so to wrap up this part, once more about how SRM works. Here are once more the performance advantages of SRM. So SRM is the ideal technique for you if you want to monitor concentrations of a rather small set of predefined target proteins or PTMs that are of interest for your project. The cool advantage of SRM is that you can cover such a wide dynamic quantification range. So Mike also had this in his slide. So 4 orders of magnitude is often no problem to achieve with SRM. You can measure very sensitively with SRM, with shotgun proteomics, or also with a technique like SWOT-MS. The sensitivity is not as good as you can achieve it with SRM. You have this high degree of reproducibility and repeatability, simply because you tell the instrument in advance exactly what it should measure for you. And in our days, SRM measurements are well supported by public resources. So we're all here in the Skyline course. We have a lot of cool software out now and lots of spectral repositories that we can use, and which facilitates SRM measurements really very, very easily in our days to quickly progress with them. However, there are also the downsides of SRM. We brought them up already. You need to know what to look for in advance, and for every peptide that you would like to analyze with SRM, you need prior knowledge, and this is what I call in this presentation the peptide query parameters, and we will look now in the next talk, in the next part in very much detail what these peptide query parameters actually entail. We have a low resolution of the triple quadrupole instrument, so when you are interested in really quantifying the peptides that have very, very similar masses, then this might be a problem with SRM as you elect this high resolution. And you have also this limited multiplexing capacity, so 1,000 transitions in the range of this range is what you can achieve with a reasonable upfront analysis time. Okay. Are there any more questions to how SRM works? Good. Then let's have a look at how to design an SRM experiment. So let's assume you would like to do now your first SRM experiment. What do you need to consider and think about? And what you need, I said it already, you need these peptide query parameters, and peptide query parameters contain information on many different levels. And you can visualize this quite nicely on this workflow slide. So the first thing that you need to know about is, we said it many times, your target proteins. For each of your target protein, you then need to know which peptides should represent that protein. For each peptide, then you would like to know how does this peptide behave on your LC, and how does your peptide behave on the mass spectrometer. So what are the Q1 and Q3 masses? What is the collision energy that I should use? And then there is a last parameter that we would also like to know in advance and to store. And this is the relative transition intensity information. So you would not just like to know which transitions to select here, but you would also like to know what is the most intense transition, the second most intense, and what is the relative intensity to each other. And for an SRM measurement, actually all these parameters that are shown in red here are strictly required before the measurement. So this you need to know. While these ones shown in yellow are optional parameters in the sense that they are not strictly required to start the measurement, even though LC information is required if you want to do a scheduled run, as we just discussed. Then this is also strictly required. But if you go non-scheduled, you don't need this before the measurement. But both of these parameters here are also very, very important and useful for data analysis after you have done the measurement. And this is why all of those parameters are important to figure out in advance and to store in form of these peptide parameters, peptide query parameters. And how do this look like? So how are they stored? Well, in the end, everything you need to produce is just a big table of parameters, okay? And these tables very often look like this or some form of this. And here you just find all this information I just brought up, the proteins, the peptides, how they behave on the mass spectrometer, and how they behave on the LC. And I will just now in the next slides go through all those different columns with you and discuss a bit things to think about or how they are produced and what's important to consider. So let's start with the proteins first. So protein selection. How do you select the proteins for your project? And there's actually not much for me to tell you about this other than that this depends on each project, obviously. So what people do often is they mine the literature, they take prior mass spec data, or they take any other type of data that is out there and that involves in some way proteins, and they just try to gather their target list, protein list based on these various different inputs. The only general thing that I can say is, depending on your protein numbers, you might want to select the one or the other approach. So a perfect protein list for an SRM or non-PRM measurement is in the range of 10 to maximally 100. Everything above gets really painful to be measured by SRM or PRM. If you have a lot more target proteins you're interested in, then SWOF-MS or other DIA methods are the method of choice for you. Okay, easy. We have selected proteins now. The next question is much more difficult, and Mike brought that up also a little bit already. If we have this list of proteins, which peptides should we select for these proteins? Because if we look at proteins and if we digest proteins, then they produce a large number of peptides, of course. And here's one example from this paper down here where they have digested beta-lactoglobulin with trypsin, and here you see all the peptides that are formed from that protein, and you see that actually just this short fraction here in the front are tryptic peptides. There are a lot of partially tryptic peptides formed as well. And the big question now that everybody asks is, which of these peptides should I use now to quantify my protein? Because with SRM and PRM, what we want to do is we don't want to target all 80 that were described here, but we want to have 3 to maybe 5. Otherwise, our transition list gets full too quickly. And which one shall we choose? What do you think of those ones up here? Which one would you choose? big one. Yeah.
Protein specific.
Protein specific. Mm-hmm. That fly nice, exactly the big ones, the intense ones, exactly here we have intensity on that axis. Yeah, you're right. So that's exactly what people do. They try to select peptides that fulfill two criteria, and the first one is it should be the best flying peptides of that protein. And luckily we saw, and I think that is often the case, these best flying are also the fully tryptic ones. Very often, maybe not necessarily always, but typically people go for the most intense tryptic peptides. Now, the next question is, how do you know what are the most intense tryptic peptides? How do you find that out? What can you do?
Check.
Yeah. Pilot experiment, very good. What did you want to say?
I go with SRM Atlas and see that it is already.
You're both right. So the best way to select peptides, first of all, use empirical data. There are also ways to predict which are the most intense peptides. There are tools out there, and it might be also useful to work with them, but much better is to use empirical data. And empirical data, there are two sources of empirical data. You can use the data of other people, which makes a lot of sense, and you should always do that. And there are repositories out there that we have in Proteomics, and there are just 4 examples even here, where you can go and where you can look your protein of interest, with which peptide is it described, how many spectrum counts does a certain peptide have, and you should use this resource. However, even better is to also do to produce your own data in a pilot experiment, and by simply doing, typically DDA measurements on your instrument and your sample set in your institution, and that will give you even more reliable information what are the best peptides for your proteins. And you can use for this proteome mapping experiments either your sample of interest. You can, if you want to be very sensitive, so if you want to go deep into the proteome, you can fractionate your sample of interest and measure them using DDA. You can also work with synthetic peptides, so there are various vendors who provide quite cheap synthetic peptides that are very dirty, but for this purpose of peptide query parameter generation, they're actually very useful. So they cost in the range of 10 to 20 euros. And then another very elegant way is also to use full-length recombinant or in vitro synthesized proteins and do your initial screening of the best peptides based on them, no matter what you do. And on this slide, I just quickly would like to show you that also Skyline supports you, and it makes this peptide selection from empirical data really easy, because what you can do in Skyline is you can use these peptide settings and the library tab, and you can upload and build a spectral library from your shotgun data that you have generated in your pilot experiment, by building a library from the raw files and from a peptide search that you have done. And then you can set these parameters here to pick peptides from this library, and you would like to have 6 peptides, and you would like to rank those peptides now by different features I use here by picked intensity, and then Skyline will, from the empirical data that you give it, will do this selection automatically for you. And in tutorial 1 this afternoon, we will exactly practice and play a little bit around. So for those people who are not so experienced with Skyline and for whom this was too fast, we will practice all of that exactly this afternoon. Yeah?
I wonder how all those resources take into account modifications that are nature-made and human-made for the selection of potential peptides.
So if we use this type of filtering and just load the data, not at all. I mean, everything the software does is it will just scan through the peptides, and it will rank them by intensity. So if you have done your peptide search without modification, they're not even included in there, right? I will come back to this question a little bit later. You will see on the next 2 slides there are a few more comments to that as well. Okay? So, and I said that in the beginning there are actually 2 criteria how people select peptides, and that was also already raised here in the audience, and that's not only people look for most intense peptides, but they also look for unique peptides in order to be really selective for one protein and not for others. So ideally, you would like to use a peptide that is only present in one protein and not shared, right? And this people usually define or you can define peptide uniqueness, of course, on various different levels, and what 99% of the people typically do is they simply define this peptide uniqueness based on protein level, so based on the open reading frame, theoretically open reading frame coded proteins of an organism. However, if you're, for example, interested in looking at different splice isoforms or different SNPs, then you must define your peptide uniqueness, of course, taking these things into account as well. So you must decide for your project, how do you want to define peptide uniqueness? And very often, people use the protein level for that. Okay, so there is again a scientific expression that you find in the literature for peptides that fulfill these two criteria, and this is called proteotypic peptides. So peptides that are unique and that are very intense in your mass spectrometer. However, recently there is another term that came up and that is used, and that's the term quantitative peptide. Did anybody of you hear that before? Yeah? What's a quantitative peptide?
It's a prototypic peptide which has appropriate response characteristics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So every quantitative peptide is also a prototypic peptide, but not every prototypic is a quantitative peptide, because quantitative peptides just fulfill additional criteria that make it optimally suited for quantification. And I tried to summarize these different criteria on this slide, and I quickly would like to go through it, and this is where also these PTMs come up a little bit that you were just referring to. So a quantitative peptide, a peptide that is ideally suited for quantification, is a peptide that is completely cleaved from the mother protein, right? You would like to have peptides that are 100% cleaved on both sides, and this is why people usually don't use peptides that are somehow miscleaved or partially tryptic, because you would never know this is done to 100%. When you work with trypsin, it's also known that when you have two neighboring basic amino acids at either end, often trypsin does a bad job cleaving those. It is known that trypsin is bad when there is an acidic residue close to the cleavage site, so an aspartate or a glutamate, so try to avoid peptides that have this. Usually we say that trypsin does not cleave a KP or an RP sequence, but it has been shown that sometimes it actually does to some extent, so also this try to avoid peptides with this sequence inside. And it's just try to avoid peptides, and also this Mike showed on his slide a little bit, that have strange or very slow digestion kinetics. So if you follow digestion over time, you see sometimes peptides that are very, very slow formed or that even degrade over time. So ideally choose peptides that are digested fast and are constant then just in your sample. That would be a quantitative peptide. Then we also want to have peptides that are stable over time. So you don't want peptides that somehow degrade in your autosampler or that somehow seem to disappear when you have freezing or thawing cycles. Then a quantitative peptide should be a peptide that is not prone to chemical modifications. So if you have tryptophan or methionine, they can oxidize. If you have NG or OG, they can deamidate. If you have at your N terminus a Q, an E, or a carbamethylated cysteine, they can cyclize. And finally, there is the big field of biological modification, PTMs. So if you want to quantify the protein abundance, then you don't want to use a peptide that is modified to represent your total protein. And so ideally avoid peptides that carry a biological PTM. So unfortunately, we don't know all the PTMs and where they sit, but what you can do is you can check repositories and see if the peptides that you have selected are not appearing in PTM repositories. You can try to avoid known motifs like the NXST motifs of glycosylation, or you can avoid N and C terminal peptides. As we know, the N and C terminals of proteins is more prone to degradation. And I think all of these additional criteria that you see here are all valid and are all important and can improve your quantitative results as they all address certain issues. However, if you apply all of these features to your proteins of interest, very frequently you will not end up with a single peptide that fits. So in reality, it's just very hard. We would love to apply all of them, but it's just not practical to do that. So what people often do is they start relaxing on those criteria. And to make you, well, my personal approach to that, and to make me feel not too bad about relaxing on those criteria, is that some of these criteria, especially these first three, these criteria can be not so problematic in the moment when your aim is to perform a relative quantification, and if you can make sure that whatever happens in these cases happens to the same extent on all the samples that you would like to relatively compare, okay? Even if your peptide gets oxidized on the methionine to 80%, as long as this is the case over all the samples you would like to compare, your relative ratio will actually still be correct, okay? These things, this is why as long as you control, and it's a big question, how do you control and how you're sure, but if you keep all the samples that you would like to relatively compare close together, treat them the same way, I think it is quite valid to say that you can account for some of these things. However, in the moment when you want to do absolute quantification, what we just discussed, so if you want to work with a peptide to determine the protein copy per cell number of a protein in the sample, any error that happens on any of these things will immediately impact your results, or you will immediately get wrong what you get. And that's also one reason why you have all these issues that even though you quantify several peptides for a protein, they might give you all different values, and it's very tricky business. Okay. So now we have selected proteins, we have selected proteotypic or quantotypic peptides. The next task to come up with to get your peptide query parameters is the mass spectrometric behavior. So all of those columns here, which include information, what is the best precursor ion and what is the best fragment ion, so on and so forth. And the problem is, again, that if we have selected a peptide, this peptide can be present in different precursor charge states, and it can produce a whole range of different fragment ions, including Y, B, A, Z, X, Z ions, water loss, amine loss ions, and again, for SRM, we are limited in the number of transitions that we can measure, so ideally we would not like to measure more than 4 to 6 transitions per peptide. And again, the question is, which one shall we choose? And what's the answer? Which one shall we choose? As many as you can afford. That's a good answer. I keep that in mind. Yeah? But, I mean, in this example here, which ones would you choose? The unique ones, also good, but the high intense ones. So the answer is exactly the same like the answer of the peptide selection. What people do is exactly the same. They go for the most intense and for the unique transitions. So in our example here, we would pick the doubly charged precursor because it's much higher than the triply charged, and we would pick Y7, Y8, Y4, and Y5 because these are the most intense ones. Exactly, and at the same time, people also try to be unique, so to pick really transitions that give you just one signal in the end and try to avoid transitions that might be shared. There's another peptide component that has a similar precursor, similar fragments, and then you end up with 2 signals and you don't know which one is what. And again, how do you find out? Empirical data. That's the best source to find that out. So again, use public repositories where MS2 spectra information is provided. And so any of the ones I showed on the peptide slide before can be useful for that, because typically people also deposit their MS2 information there. These are targeted proteomics specific repositories like SRM, Atlas, Panorama. So here you find these peptide query parameters, and you can also generate your own data. That's always the very best thing because it takes into account your specific setup and your samples at your home place. And you can work with the same type of samples as I just named before, also to figure out what are the best transitions. And again, just to show you that Skyline does support you a lot in this selection. So if you have defined a library in Skyline, you can use the transition settings and the library to say, okay, automatically give me the 5 most intense transitions if a library spectrum is available for a specific peptide, and then Skyline does all of that job of intense transition selection automatically for you. But again, this we will do in tutorial 1 and you will practice that. Yeah? Was there a question? No? Yeah?
Well, if you have proteins that you're particularly interested in, but they do not usually fly very well or are difficult to have a lot of transitions, are those still useful? Are they still useful?
Well, so I'm not 100% sure I know what you're referring to, but for example, what I often have problems with is with short peptides. So very short peptides, let's say 5 or 6 amino acids, tend to be not identified in a DDA run, because we have even often this minimal 7 amino acids, even if we go down. But they still can be beautifully suitable for thyroid proteomics and give very nice peaks. They don't have so many transitions. This is why DDA doesn't identify them. But when you have a synthetic peptide and you measure it and you validate peptide parameters, even if it's then just 1 or 2 transitions that are usable or 3, of course, then once you've validated with a synthetic peptide version, you can choose that. If your peptide is like, just bad digestible, not stable, if this is the reason why you don't see it, then of course also a very good assay, very good peptide parameters will still not help you detecting it. Okay? Did that answer the question?
Yes.
Yeah?
I would like to add solubility also, like in the final matrix, if it is acidic pH, and some peptides tend to precipitate, and you can predict those things prior to selecting those peptides. Because solubility is one factor which can give you like a very
So there is a good tool to predict whether it's soluble or not?
Yeah.
What is that tool? Tell me. Give it to me. I'm happy to use it. Yeah? And that works well also?
Yeah, it works well. You can predict, like sometimes we order heavy level peptides and they are not soluble.
Oh, but is
So
it like
then we went
SSR5
back
or no, it's again something else?
based on iodization pattern. You can choose the like if they are going to be soluble in acidic pH or basic pH test.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, if it's a trust, it's the same like using prediction tools, which is based on the primary amino acid of the protein, tell you also that is probably the best triplet peptide, which just from what I read in the literature is not working super well. I think it's very hard to predict this really in advance, and I always favor empirical data over that. Okay, so we're almost done with this third part. The last part is just the normalized retention time information, and this I told you already. I wanted to give you a little bit more information on how this is actually calculated and done. So this last column here contains the information of how your peptides behave on the LC. And here's once more the overview. Why is that useful? We said it already. We need retention time information if we want to schedule our SRM runs or our PRM runs. But there is the second reason why we want retention time information that is equally important and valid, and this is we want to use it for scoring. So we want to see, does the predicted value fit to the value where I see a peak? And that's important not only for SRM and PRM, but also for the other targeted approaches like DIA swath and MS1 filtering. Okay, so, and we already said, problem, retention times that we measure are dependent on the platform where we generate it, and we want to standardize this information now with the IRTs. And here you see the reason why this works. So what you see here are 11 peptides that are measured with an LC gradient of 40 minutes. And then you see the exactly same peptides measured with a gradient of 70 minutes. And what you can see is that, yes, the retention time of all that peptide changes between the two gradients, but it changes in a very systematic way, right? So the order of the peptides is still the same, and even the relative difference between these peaks is the same. So mathematically, when you plot the retention times in gradient A and gradient B, you have a very good linear correlation, okay? And that's the reason why it is possible, because of this linear correlation, to convert retention times from one MS run into another MS run. So if you make one run, you can predict how the retention time will be here in the moment when you know the linearity between those two samples, okay? Well, this linearity or this correlation holds true very well if you work with different gradient lengths, as shown here, or if you work with different column dimensions. The error will get larger and larger when you do bigger changes. So if you, for example, work with another mobile or other stationary phase, then this linearity will start falling apart and not work so well anymore. But I guess many proteomic labs work with the same mobile and the same stationary phase, and then this conversion is actually very easily doable. Okay, so what the people have now come up with is, in order to make this transferability of retention time between experiments or even between labs, is they said, okay, let's work with a set of retention time reference peptides. And here I show you the set from a company called Diagnosis. They published this in 2012, but by now they're also many other commercial sets available from peers or from Thermo. All of them have in common there's a rather small set of peptides. These peptides are selected in a way that they are not naturally occurring, so you can spike them into any sample. And they are selected in a way that they should cover a broad retention time range, so the first peptide elutes very early and the last one very late. And what these authors now have done with this set of retention time peptides is they simply defined what they call the IRT value to these peptides, which means they simply defined an arbitrary unit to each of these peptides, and they did that in a way that they decided, okay, the second peptide should have an IRT value of 0 and the last one of 100. This is not the retention time, this is not in minutes or seconds, it's just an arbitrary value. And by deciding the second peptide is 0, the last peptide is 100, they then assembled the retention time of all the other peptides so that they have this nice linear correlation. So here you see plotted the actually measured retention time versus the IRT value, and by setting this one to 0 and this one to 100, they created this linear correlation, okay? And what you can do now when you do this trick, you can simply measure any target peptide together with these 11 reference peptides. So let's assume we have a target peptide X that has a retention time of 21 minutes. And you can use then this linear correlation and transform these 21 minutes into an IRT value of 35.9. And that's the value that you store in your peptide query parameter table here in this column. Yes, there was a question?
So they have set the 0 value on the second peptides, but the 100 to the last peptide. Why, like, maybe if you have your own set of peptides that you want to use?
You don't need to do this at all. So I heard the rumor that this first peptide was quite irreproducible. So it had a bigger variance between instruments, so they decided to go for this one. It completely is arbitrary, and if you do this yourself, you can also put this value to 1 million and 2 million. You decide what you can use any number. The reason why they didn't go for the first one, the second one, was, as far as I know, because this was less stable. And that's also what I see very often. The peptides at the very extremes tend to have bigger variance than the one in the middle. So
another reason was the first peptide, a lot of time it doesn't point to the column at all, so basically shoot out.
So maybe they should have just removed the peptide. It would make it for these didactic lectures much more easy. Okay, so but I hope you understood how you generate these IRT values and which are then stored in these peptide query parameters. But now you can of course say, okay, I have now IRT values, what do I do? I mean, why is it something useful to do? And to understand this is that you can actually use these IRT values now in a new run to convert back all of those values into a real retention time. Everything that you need to do in order to make that possible is you need to spike your IRT reference peptides into your sample of interest and do one measurement in advance where you measure these IRT peptides. Okay, you once need to establish this linear correlation where you have measured on your current setup with your current LC, column length, column age, whatever, all these IRT peptides. And then you plot the IRT values of those as provided by the manufacturer versus their actual retention times. Then you have established your equation in your current condition. And then you can simply say, now I take my peptide query list, which I got from Panorama, and you can say, okay, this first peptide has 88.2 IRT. This will mean on my setup, I will need to look for this peptide at 28.8 minutes. Okay, that's the important point to understand, that you can use IRT values by once measuring only the reference peptides on your current setup. You get automatically all the values for potentially a long list of thousands of peptides with just one measurement. But one measurement is still necessary. You once need to establish the linear dependency on your current LC setup. And again, luckily we don't need to do all of these linear correlations back and forth ourselves in Excel. But Skyline can do all of that in the background so that you don't need to do anything. Everything you need to do is to set up an IRT calculator where you once specify the standard peptides that you want to work with, and you can see here many of the commercial products are even automatically selectable, but you can also generate your own IRT standards, also possible. Then you need to provide the IRT values of your target peptides, and then Skyline will predict retention times for you automatically and can do these linear correlations. And also this we will see how this works in detail, and you will do it yourself in tutorial 1. So the wrap-up of this, this third part is that, yeah, generating these peptide query parameters tables is actually quite tedious. So to generate optimal and validated assays is often the most work time and cost-intensive part of a project. However, the good news is that once developed, you can use those parameters quite universally. You can store them, you can share them with the community, and there are several repositories out there by now. We named some of them already, where you can go and where you can retrieve peptide query parameters, but where you can also go and put your peptide query parameters on. So if, in case you went through this process, really make other people benefit from it as well, and deposit them here. Okay, so time is already over. So it's Brandon here. What shall we do? Shall we make a break now? This last part will take another 10 minutes, I guess. So but we can do it during the tutorials as well. It's also fine, I guess.
Go ahead.
What is the feeling of the group? You are not super tired? Okay, well then we do the last part as well. So because here I just wanted to show you some data, just that you know, get a little bit of feeling what we're talking about here all the time. So if you want to identify now, make sure that you have identified a peptide correctly in your SRM measurements. There are actually 6 criteria that you can apply. And the first criteria is the one of coelution. We brought this up already, Mike said it also. If you measure several transitions of the same peptide precursor, all of those transitions should actually coelute because they all originate from the same peptide. And if you see a figure like this, where this blue transition is clearly shifted a bit to the left and looks like a shoulder, then this has an interference here and should not be used for quantification. Then there is the criterion of peak shape. Same theory, if we measure several transitions of the same peptide precursor, it should have exactly the same peak shape. So if you see peaks like this that are not nicely Gaussian shaped, but they are all not nicely Gaussian shaped, it's even bigger confirmation for you that it all comes from the same peptide precursor. And then there is this third criterion of signal intensity. So if you work, you need to be a bit careful with this one. If you work with an optimized, validated peptide query parameter set for a given peptide, it's likely that it's the most intense peak that you see in your signal. This is your target peptide. However, if it happens that you have an interference from a peptide that is way more abundant than your target peptide, even though the parameters are not optimal for that, it still might be that the small guy is your target peptide and not the big one. Nevertheless, in combination with other criteria that I show you here, also the intensity is definitely something to take into account and to look into. So these 3 criteria that you see here can always be applied just by looking at SRM data. You don't need to have any additional information. You can always check them. Unfortunately, and you will see this soon, this is not enough often to really be confident in that you are sure you have picked the right peak. And this is why it's important to have additional information. And one additional piece of information that you can use to make sure you're looking at the right peak is correlation to a library spectrum. So if you have an MS2 spectrum acquired and identified for your target peptide from a repository or from own DDA data that you did, then what you would expect is that the most intense transition in your SRM trace should also be the most intense transition, most intense fragment in the MS2 spectra. So you would expect a correlation between those two. Then there is correlation of retention time. If you have done IRT prediction or if you have used a retention time predictor, you would like to see that the peak that you find is close to the predicted retention time. And the last criteria and the strongest criteria is a correlation with an isotope labeled reference. So if you have an isotope labeled reference present in your sample, then what you would expect is that the light and the heavy peptide have exactly the same intensities in their relative transition intensities, and they are perfectly coeluting, and they have the same peak shape. And it's also something that you can check in your data if you have a heavy reference present. And now I just brought a few screenshots from my own data where I would like to practice these 6 criteria a bit with you together. So this is an example from yeast, where I've tried to measure this yeast protein with this peptide sequence. I have monitored with these 5 transitions. You can see it's a non-scheduled run because you see actually data here over the whole retention time up to 50 minutes. And you see that there's just one peak. So I think I have a zoom in as well. So just by looking at peak shape, coelution, intensity, the first 3, I'm then sure this is it. I'm done. I can just integrate it and quantify it. But I think this RPS6A protein is one of the most abundant proteins in yeast. So such beautifully clean data is very rare when you work with complex peptide mixtures. Much more often it looks like this. So here, other protein, RAS2 kinase, was monitored again with 5 peptides, and you see that there are actually 2 peaks where we have pretty decent peak. What do you think? Is it the one here at 16.4 minutes or at 23.9 minutes? Any guesses?
Let's look at the fragmentation. Yeah.
We look at the fragmentation.
The intensity of the wire.
Fragmentation of what? What?
You have to look at the MSNS.
The
Look
MS2.
at the ratios. Yeah.
But I don't have an MS2 at this stage. Who thinks it's the one at 16.4 minutes? Who thinks it's the one at 23.9 minutes? Why?
It looks like the 16.4 is maybe missing the transition.
Well observed. But I think the people who didn't raise their hand are actually the right ones, because I think you can really not tell by these 2 peaks to be really sure which one it is, right? You're absolutely right. So the blue transition here is 0. We have only 4 transitions, and here we have 5 transitions, and you're absolutely right. It's a very good, I guess, not many people got this so far. but still, even then, I wouldn't publish. I wouldn't publish a paper where I say, I'm sure it's this one. Just by looking at coelution, peak shape, and intensity, it's very risky here to do that. So we need more information, and we said it. We have an MS2 spectra, and yes, I have an MS2 spectra where the query parameters were built for this peptide. That's the one up here, and you see really bad. So the Y9 transition here is the most intense one, and the Y9 is the purple one. And Skyline also has a very fast and cool way to give you the information how an MS2 spectra and those transitions here match. That's the dot product. It's called dot product, and you see always this dot product behind the peptide sequence. And the dot product at Skyline calculated for this peak was 0.99, and for this was 0.82. So with this additional information, I would publish the paper. So now I would say, yeah, that's the peak, and this is just an interference that by coincidence had very similar Q1, 4 of the 5 transitions shared. Damn it, not very selective with the assay. Okay, super. But very often SRM data looks even worse. So this is another kinase. And this is the chromatogram of those 4 transitions. What can we do? Any ideas?
Go through your library.
Go through a library.
Find out what is peptide at what retention time was identified.
Use retention information. Super. Yeah, that would be one good thing to do. Yeah. What else could we do?
Isotope labeled peptide?
As an isotope labeled peptide. That's what I said. It's the strongest one. Unfortunately, I didn't have an isotope labeled peptide, and I wasn't allowed to buy one. So what I did was, it was done in yeast. So I grew a 15N labeled yeast sample. That was very cheap. And then I made a 1-to-1 mixture of a 15N labeled yeast sample. Oh, this I forgot. So this is, by the way, the library spectrum. And just to show you that I got actually many peaks with quite decent dot products from this library value here as well, because, and that's also something that you see sometimes, it's when you have several transitions with more or less similar intensity, that's also what noise very often has. So actually, you can get also from noise when they are not having a very distinct pattern. You get also a good dot product sometimes. So you need to be a bit careful of that. And in this case, even the MS2 spectrum didn't help me to really identify the peptide. But when I did these 15 N-labeled yeast, here you see the signal of the 15 N-labeled yeast. And now I check, do I have somewhere a signal where I see coelution of light and heavy? And you must believe me now, there was just here at this 11 minutes, there was a peak where I could see a nice coelution of heavy and light. And when I zoomed in, this was a peak where also the relative intensities were similar. And this was a peak with a good dot product. And this was a peak close to the predicted retention time. So with taking all the 6 tools I have in hand, including the heavy reference, wasn't a spike in, was a complete proteome, then I was quite confident and could quantify this peptide. Before, it would have been impossible to do this, okay? And just to be complete, there are also examples where no matter what you do, you will just not be able to identify anything in your sample, okay? So that's also happening in SRM, and you must be able to detect this. And sometimes these are actually the most difficult cases to decide. Here, I cannot detect anything, or here I can detect something. Yeah, that's it. Take-home messages from this presentation. I hope I could show you that targeted proteomics is a highly accurate, reproducible way of doing peptide and protein quantification. The field of targeted proteomics is really growing and booming at the moment. We not only have these classical SRM and PRM approaches, but you will hear throughout the week also much more about targeted DDA and targeted DIA. SRM is the ideal technique if you want to target a rather small set of peptides or proteins, and its biggest advantage is that you have this really wide dynamic quantification range, 4 to 5 orders of magnitude. So you're very sensitive and reproducible, but you have a rather low resolution when you work with triple quads. You have a limited multiplexing capacity, 1,000 transitions is the max, and you need to generate these peptide query parameters. And peptide query parameters include information about which proteins, which peptides are the best representatives for these proteins, and we discussed prototypic and quantotypic features. It also contains information how the peptides behave on the mass spectrometer and how they behave on your LC. And ideally, these parameters should all be derived from empirical data, whether it's repositories or own experiments. And what the people tend to do is they use the most intense and unique peptides and the most intense and unique transitions. This is how you select and how you get started with your measurements. And with this, I'm at the end of the presentation, and I'm open to any more questions. Thanks. Yeah?
How do you optimize the collision energy?
That's a very good question also. So honestly, very often I don't optimize collision energies at all. So if you want to have a really ideal assay, peptide query parameters, because you're very specifically interested in certain peptides and you need to get the maximum sensitivity out, that's a way to do it, and you can do it, you should do it. And there are also ways within Skyline. There's also a tutorial how you can do it by ramping certain collision energies. You can do it on a peptide level, on a transition level, and you can definitely gain some sensitivity by that, even though my experience with it is that for some peptides, in general, it is not very large, the gain that you can have it. For some peptides, it can be large, but in general, it's almost minor. So for many of the standard projects, I stopped optimizing collision energies. Yeah, but if you have the time to spend on it, and if you want, if you're not interested in a lot of peptides, it's definitely something you can do. And that is just, and you empirically try different values, and then you select the one that gives you the highest intensity.
Yeah, I'll add to that. We have a paper on it that you can read. It was one of the early papers that we did with Skyline when we developed features to actually do collision energy optimization, which Skyline does pretty well. And having seen more data on average, as Tina pointed out, you get less than 10% signal intensity increase, although that varies and that's an average, and so there can be ones that you get more. But in the paper, we pretty much recommend that you save collision energy optimization until sort of late stage assay development, when you're really trying to get the highest precision and the most, and you're preparing to measure potentially hundreds to thousands of samples.
And if
Not
it's a
in that, if
clinical
you're not in that
assay,
situation, then
exactly. If it's these two peptides that are these clinical assay for you and your sample core, then it's absolutely worth collecting for the last 10%. At an earlier stage, where most of the projects I'm working on are, I say the time really limited.
But it will also depend on which kind of instrument you're using. Like every site is very sensitive.
You would do it for every instrument that you do. It can be very different from instrument. It can even be different from the same type, right? If you have two triple thermal triple quads, we have seen differences between the two exactly same instruments. And it's but what's even more different is people tend to optimize collision energy on the peptide level, so that you just say, okay, I want the best peptide response, but use the same collision energy for every transition. And that gives you even more, I think, to do even on a transition level, right? So for every transition, you can have then different collision energies for different transitions of the same peptide precursor.